Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to be showing you a Jack Russell portrait I did a few years ago. Now this is going to focus on more of the longer overlapping type of fur texture. So the tips and techniques that I'm going to share throughout this video can be applied to many different types of fur textures. Now, like with all portraits, I always start off with the eye first. For me, I want to make sure that I get this right at the very early stage, because if the eyes are incorrect, it's just going to throw off the entire piece. Now, this is where most of the expression and emotion stems from. So all I do to start with is map out the general shape of the eye. I'll put in the brightest part of the highlight if that's required. Some eyes you're not going to have an overly bright highlight. The first tip, if you do have an eye that's got a white highlight there and it's one of the brightest parts of the portrait, leave the white of the paper free. Don't put any graphite down in that area. Then, as you can see here, I'm just starting to gradually darken up my layers and reinforce the shape of the eye via my shadows. The shape of the eye is really important. You don't want the edges of the eyes to have too many harsh edges, because it's going to make the eye look flatter and two-dimensional. You really want to make sure that we're getting the 3D sphere shape of the eye, and that's all where you place your highlights and your shadows. I am using a kneaded putty eraser there just to remove some of the top layers of graphite to add in some of those lighter but subtle highlights. So when it comes to the fur on any animal, I would always recommend to work on small sections. You're going to see here that I'm using graphite powder and an eye makeup applicator to apply my very first layer of graphite to my paper. Now, I do have a video here on YouTube that I uploaded last week, I think it was, and it's showing you how you can create graphite powder yourself if you don't have any that you've pre-bought from an art shop. So if you would like to see how you can create your own graphite powder, then I'll link that in the description below. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm just putting in a base foundation. I don't want to be working against the white of the paper, because for me, I just find it a bit harder to judge your values. If you've got a base layer of graphite down first, you can then build up your layers from there, and I do find, especially for this longer but softer fur texture, this technique works really well. Once I've put that first layer of graphite powder down, I'm softening all of my edges. If you notice from the corner of the eye here, there are no harsh lines. Even at this stage now, I'm starting to use just a standard HB pencil to add in the first layer of texture around the eye, but still maintaining those soft edges. When you're working on longer fur texture like this, harsh edges and those real sudden start and stop points are going to give the opposite effect. They won't make that fur look soft. So that's one of my biggest tips for this type of fur texture. Now, the other thing that I talk about in all of my tutorials is 3 things that will massively affect how realistic you can get any fur texture. And they are the fur direction, the fur length, and the fur thickness. Now, for this specific type of fur texture, you really want to be extending your pencil strokes to replicate the length of that fur. You then want to apply the right amount of pressure to that pencil, which will determine how thick that line is going to be. And then you also want to be focusing on that fur direction. So notice here how I'm always moving my hand and curving my pencil strokes. Another thing that I'm doing here is I'm mapping in my reference points. I'll be switching between a HB and a 2B so that I can start to map in some of those darker values. Now, with any fur texture, I want to be building up any dark values gradually. I don't want to be jumping to my darkest pencil, something like an 8B or a 9B first. One of the main reasons is you won't have as much depth in that fur if you do that, because you don't have any layers underneath it. And the second is you will end up with something called Graphite Shine. Now, Graphite Shine is where it's reflecting, the light is bouncing off of the sheen of the graphite, which will be more obvious if you've used your darker, softer pencils early on. So they're the 2 main reasons why I like to layer up gradually. Okay, so when I'm using the eraser here, I have slowed this clip down for a moment so you can see how I'm using the graphite powder and the eraser together. I can't subtract these details here, those highlighted clumps of fur, if I don't have the dark layer in behind it. This layering order is really important when you're working on this type of fur texture. Now, I also uploaded a video last week and it's showing you my 2 must-have erasers. I also show you in that video how you can adapt those erasers to create even finer types of details. So I use the subtraction technique. If that's of interest, I'll also link that at the end of this video. So once I've started mapping in my main shapes using my darker pencils and then my erasers, it's all just a matter of refining that one section that I'm working on. Now, I've briefly spoken about it at the beginning of the video, but the fur direction for this fur texture is so important. Look at the ears here, how I've got all of these subtle change in fur directions in one small area. Even if it's just 1 or 2 pencil strokes, indicating at that change in direction is going to really help to follow the shape of that animal's face. Now, the fur direction is not random, it will be following the underlying bone and muscular structure. The longer coated that animal is, the more freedom of movement that fur is going to have. However, it will still originate from the shape of the skull underneath the skin. So the fur direction is so important. If that fur direction is not right, we will end up with a portrait that doesn't look as much like that animal as it should, which is obviously really not what we want. We want to go for as close to that reference photo as we can. Okay, so sticking with the way that I like to work in those small sections, I then make my way across to the right hand side. Once I've got the right eye in, it's a matter of repeating the same layering process, but still paying really close attention to those 3 factors: the fur direction, fur length, and fur thickness. You can see here that I'm working with the fur that's closest to the skin, and then I'm layering up from there, so I'm building up that depth gradually. With this type of fur texture, it's very easy to try and map in the clumps of fur that we see first. The problem is, usually those clumps of fur are sitting on the very top, so they should be left until the last layer. This is where your erasers and the softening via a paintbrush or the eye makeup applicators can really help to remove that graphite, but then soften your edges. So in the last couple of weeks, I have been uploading a few graphite tutorials with voiceover, and I am looking to add a graphite tier to my Patreon channel. All of those tutorials will be in real time with a voiceover while I'm drawing, so it's very step by step. Every single process would be explained. So when that goes live, I will put a link to that in the comments below. It's not live at the moment, so do check on that comments, and as soon as it does go live and it's available, I will make sure that I post it on all of the comments on my graphite tutorials. But if you've got any questions about that, maybe if you would like to see graphite tutorials on Patreon, let me know in the comments below. I'd really love to hear your feedback. So one big tip that can really help with any element, any fur texture, is if you're working on one specific part and it's something that you're struggling to process, maybe however many times you've tried working on that area, you just can't get it right. Turn your artwork around, turn it upside down, and turn your reference photo upside down, and then work on it that way, because your brain will be forced to see the abstract shapes rather than thinking, I should be drawing fur, I know what that looks like, because our brain has a tendency to override what we see. So turning everything around can really eliminate that. By the time you then flip everything back up the right way, it's far more accurate to the reference photo just using that one technique. So when it came to the bridge of the nose and the fur around the muzzle, this can get very overwhelming. Break it up into individual layers. Whenever you've got a fur texture like this, you really do want to be putting in the fur that's behind it first. It will make the entire process much easier. The one thing though, the biggest tip here is don't put too much pressure on your applicator or your pencils, because you will flatten the tooth of the paper. You'll start to burnish, which is where you do end up with a flatter surface through that additional pressure, and you then won't be able to add future layers on top, and it can also be harder to erase that graphite because you've really smoothed out that graphite and pressed it into the tooth of the paper. Now when the graphite tier goes live, I'm going to have a range of fur textures, dogs, cats, horses, and then I'm going to build up that wildlife library as well. So there's going to be something for everyone. But my Patreon channel, it currently has pastel and acrylic tutorials there, and I do like to focus on the pet portrait side of things so that any Patreon members can transfer those tips and techniques for that specific fur texture in their own portraits when they feel like they want to start taking those on themselves. So I'm looking forward to having a breed like this, a longer coated animal there in a real-time tutorial, because I do know this is one of the more challenging fur textures to get right. Now with graphite, being a black and white medium, everything's on grayscale, we do want to focus on our contrasts. Now this is something again that's going to make this specific fur texture appear with more depth, like it's a bit more of a denser type of texture. This is all in my shadows. Notice here how I'm going back in with a darker pencil to reinforce the shadows that are underneath. This is going to make it look like the lighter clumps of fur are sitting more on top, which for this type of fur texture is exactly what I want. If your very first base layer isn't dark enough, the techniques that I'm sharing here will not work in the same way. Your fur might still look like it's clumped together and overlapping, but it might not have as much depth and impact because the base layer isn't dark enough. As soon as you darken that up, it's going to make everything else appear far more three-dimensional. Now with any medium, regardless of what it is, we are always worried about going too dark early on in case we can't lighten it back up. Now with graphite, because I personally like working with a slightly smoother surface, I do have to be a little bit more careful with the type of darker layer that I put down initially, because I don't want to go too dark in case I can't lighten it up. But with the techniques and the layering process that I use here, I never run into that risk because it's all about subtle, gradual layers. I still want my contrast to be right, otherwise the fur is not going to look realistic. But I do want to make sure that the shadows and the highlights are in the right place and that they are of the right value. Something that I mention in all of my tutorials, because this is important regardless of the medium, is always look and cross-check your highlights and your shadows. So what I mean by that is look at your reference photo and think, right, what is the brightest part? Is it the highlight in the eye, or is it one specific area on the fur? What's the darkest part? Is it the inside of the nostrils or the pupil, or is there a part of the fur itself that has a very dark shadow? By making sure that you've got elements that are dark enough and your highlights that are bright enough, your contrast is going to be so sharp, and then your portrait is going to look even more realistic. So I hope that the tips and techniques that I've shared here have been useful. If they were, I would really appreciate it if you could give the video a thumbs up, because it makes a massive difference. YouTube will then share it with more people. Now if you've got any art related questions, pop them in the comments below, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And if you like the content, don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button, and then you'll get notified of future content. And here is a photo on the right of my finished portrait. I do also have a video showing you how I did the dark black fur of Ivy the Labrador, and I will link that in the description below. That's a completely different layering process. So as I've said, all of those videos that I've mentioned in this tutorial are going to be linked in the description. So as always, thank you so much for watching. I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube at the weekend.